under the influence of three external accidental causes having nothing in common, namely, thanks in the first place to the behest of a person who had become, without the slightest desire on my part, a passive cause of my arising. Secondly, on account of a tooth of mine knocked out by some ragamuffin of a boy, mainly on account of somebody else's slobberiness. And thirdly, thanks to the verbal formulation delivered in a drunken state by a person quite alien to me, some merchant of Muscovite brand. If, before my acquaintance with this all-universal principle of living, I had actualized all manifestations differently from other biped animals similar to me, arising and vegetating with me on one and the same planet, then I did so automatically, and sometimes only half consciously. But after this event, I began to do so consciously, and moreover with an instinctive sensation of the two blended impulses of self-satisfaction and self-cognizance in correctly and honorably fulfilling my duty to great nature. It must even be emphasized that although even before this event I already did everything not as others did, yet my manifestations were hardly thrust before the eyes of my fellow countrymen around me. But from the moment when the essence of this principle of living was assimilated in my nature, then on the one hand, all my manifestations, those intentional for any aim and also those simply, as is said, occurring out of sheer idleness, acquired vivifyingness, and began to assist in the formation of corns on the organs of perception of every creature similar to me without exception, who directed his attention directly or indirectly toward my actions. And on the other hand, I myself began to carry out all these actions of mine in accordance with the injunction of my deceased grandmother to the utmost possible limits. And the practice was automatically acquired in me on beginning anything new, and also at any stage, of course, on a large scale, always to utter silently or aloud, "If you go on a spree, then go the whole hog, including the postage." And now, for instance, in the present case also, since owing to causes not dependent on me, but flowing from the strange and accidental circumstances of my life, I happen to be writing books. I am compelled to do this, also in accordance with that same principle which has gradually become definite through various extraordinary combinations created by life itself, and which has blended with each atom of my entirety. This psycho-organic principle of mine I shall this time begin to actualize, not by following the practice of all writers, established from the remote past down to the present, of taking as the theme of their various writings the events which have supposedly taken place or are taking place on earth, but shall take instead as the scale of events for my writings the whole universe. Thus, in the present case also, if you take, then take. That is to say, if you go on a spree, then go the whole hog, including the postage. Any writer can write within the scale of the earth, but I am not any writer. Can I confine myself merely to this, in the objective sense, paltry earth of ours? To do this, that is to say, to take for my writings the same themes as in general other writers do, I must not, even if only because what our learned spirits affirm might suddenly indeed prove true, and my grandmother might learn of this, and do you understand what might happen to her, to my dear beloved grandmother? Would she not turn in her grave? Not once, as is usually said, but as I understand her, especially now when I can already quite skillfully enter into the position of another, she would turn so many times that she would almost be transformed into an Irish weathercock. Please, reader, do not worry. I shall, of course, also write of the earth, but with such an impartial attitude that this comparatively small planet itself, and also everything on it, shall correspond to that place which in fact it occupies, and which, even according to your own same logic arrived at, thanks of course to my guidance, it must occupy in our great universe. I must of course also make the various what are called heroes of these writings of mine, not such types as those which in general the writers of all ranks and epochs on earth have drawn and exalted, that is to say, types such as any Tom, Dick, or Harry who arise through a misunderstanding and who fail to acquire during the process of their formation up to what is called a responsible life anything at all which it is proper for an arising in the image of God, that is to say, a man, to have, and who progressively develop in themselves to their last breath only such various charms as, for instance, lasciviousness, slobberiness, amorousness, maliciousness, chicken-heartedness, enviousness, and similar vices unworthy of man. I intend to introduce in my writings heroes of such type as everybody must, as is said, willy-nilly sense with his whole being as real, and about whom in every reader data must inevitably be crystallized for the notion that they are indeed somebody, and not merely just anybody. During the last weeks, while lying in bed, my body quite sick, I mentally drafted a summary of my future writings and thought out the form and sequence of their exposition. And I decided to make the chief hero of the first series of my writings, do you know whom? The great Beelzebub himself. Even in spite of the fact that this choice of mine might from the very beginning evoke in the mentation of most of my readers such mental associations as must engender in them all kinds of automatic contradictory impulses from the action of that totality of data infallibly formed in the psyche of people owing to all the established abnormal conditions of our external life, which data are in general crystallized in people owing to the famous what is called religious morality existing and rooted in their life, and in them, consequently, there must inevitably be formed data for an inexplicable hostility toward me personally. But do you know what, reader? In case you decide, despite this warning, to risk continuing to familiarize yourself with my further writings, and you try to absorb them always with an impulse of impartiality, and to understand the very essence of the questions I have decided to elucidate, and in view also of the particularity inherent in the human psyche that there can be no opposition to the perception of good only exclusively when, so to say, a contact of mutual frankness and confidence is established, I now still wish to make a sincere confession to you about the associations arising within me, which as a result have precipitated in the corresponding sphere of my consciousness the data which have prompted the whole of my individuality to select as the chief hero of my writings just such an individual as is presented before your inner eyes by this same Mr. Beelzebub. This I did not without cunning. My cunning lies simply in the logical supposition that if I show him this attention, he infallibly, as I already cannot doubt any more, has to show himself grateful and help me by all means in his command in my intended writings. Although Mr. Beelzebub is made, as is said, of a different grain, yet since he also can think, and what